Meredith Talusan is an acclaimed author. Her book, Fairest, her memoir, has been widely praised by literary critics, and it's been very well received by readers. And it's a beautifully written coming-of-age memoir that navigates the complex spheres of race, class, sexuality, and her place in the LGBT community and the trans world. In addition to her Harvard degree, she writes for numerous national publications, and she's the founding executive editor of Them, which is Condé Nast's LGBTQ+ digital platform. I also want to thank our partner and co-sponsor for this event, the Office of Intercultural Student Engagement, specifically Courtney Dalliard, Assistant Director of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Affairs within that office. Let's give Courtney a round of applause. Courtney is here with us. And our moderators for this program, and I'll be turning it over in just a minute. Felix Simpson, Master of Social Work degree, alumna student, Special Assistant to the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center, and Ivan Chris, a student staff member at the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center as well. Please welcome Felix, Meredith, and Ivan. And a thing before we get started. You'll see there's this nice little bag. At the end of the event, some of you filled out a form. We've got our book giveaway. We want to remind you, we'll select a winner. We'll let Meredith pull a name out of the bag there, and you will get a signed copy of Fairest. So that's a little incentive. We thank you for those of you who filled that out and joined the book raffle today. So with that, we'll let Felix, I guess, take it away.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Felix. I use they, them pronouns. So I'll get started. We did a talk today already at 4:30, but I think I'm really excited for this one. So Meredith, you already know, because I told you this already, that reading this book was very impactful for me and it made me cry a bunch of times. So my first question, because I think it's a good starting question, is, what inspired you to start writing your memoir?
Yeah, well, you can hear me? Yes? Okay. Hi, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here. As Paul said, this book was published in hardcover in May of 2020. So as you can imagine, it was a really difficult time, and all of my events for it have been virtual. And it feels really great, and I'm really, really appreciative that you all took the time and amid all of the difficulties that we're having with the pandemic, to be here with us tonight. And also the other thing is, I'm going to read in the middle. We heard that this was a German format where there are questions in the beginning, and then, just kind of like a short reading in the middle. So that's what we're doing for people who know. I mean, in terms of, it's funny because I answered this question this afternoon, and I feel like I can answer it in so many different ways, right? I think the sort of factual answer is that in October of 2015, I started as a staff writer at BuzzFeed News, and one of the first articles that I wrote for BuzzFeed was a review article about trans women's memoirs. And in the context of that article, I became immersed with the genre and read, I think, 8 or 9 memoirs in the span of 2 weeks. And one of the things that I realized as I was reading them is that they're so, and many of them, actually most of them, are really wonderfully written, but they're really, at the time, which was 2015, written primarily for cisgender people to understand what being trans is like. That so much of the period before 2015 was a period where trans people were trying to explain ourselves in order for us to be able to garner respect, in order for us to be treated equally. And I just felt like that was a really unfair burden on us, both as people, but also as writers, because it didn't give us space to explore our experience beyond trying to justify ourselves in our existence. And so the germ of Fairest was really for me to explore what it is to have a trans life beyond trying to justify myself or trying to get somebody to like me or trying to get somebody to respect me, because because from my vantage point there is nothing to apologize for and there's nothing to justify about being trans. So
good evening, everyone. Hello? Yes? Okay, sorry. So my name is Ivan. I use he, they pronouns. My question is, so in the book, especially in chapter 2, you talk a lot about your Lola, your grandma. And I really wanted to know if there are like distinct memories you have that you go back to in times that you want sort of comfort, or if there's a lesson that you learned from her growing up that you still apply to this day.
I mean, I have so many fond memories of my grandmother. For people who haven't read the book, my grandmother raised me because my parents had me when they were 17. So they were very young and they were still in school. And so I was sent to my grandmother to be raised. And in a lot of ways, I think growing up, I perceived that as a really idyllic existence, because she was very protective of me as an albino kid. I was the only fair-skinned blonde person, for miles around. And that's a very weird position to be in the Philippines, because post-American colonization, there's a certain fetish for light-skinned people. But at the same time, albino people, anak araw, which literally translates to sunchild. In the Philippines, we're also thought of as ghosts, or thought of as, as aberrations of nature. And I think my grandmother was very, very adamant that I perceive myself as somebody who was special rather than abnormal. And I think for me, the thing that really, really stands out is that sort of degree of unconditional love, which I think has been very hard for me to develop as an adult, in part because of the fact that I've felt so objectified as a child. I also subsequently became a child actor in the Philippines, and so it's been very hard for me to sort of develop that type of unconditional trust in people, especially in an American context. And so when I find myself, just scared, and find it really hard to be caring or intimate, or put myself out emotionally, that's when I really remember her, just because she was really the only figure in my life who was able to communicate to me that sort of level of unconditional care, right?
So, your book is very vulnerable, and we've talked before about, what it means to write a memoir that doesn't paint yourself in a stylized, good perspective, because often when we're talking about ourselves, we want to like look good. Something I'm wondering about on that note is, what was it like to, I guess, revisit your life on an emotional level as you were writing this book?
It was very hard, but at the same time, I did feel like it was necessary for me, both not just at a literary level, but also at a personal level, to portray myself in as clear and accurate a way as possible, and that in some ways that's sort of my form of recompense for things that I've done in my life, that that if I were to do them over again, I would probably do them differently. One of them being that when I was early in my time, and it's interesting because part of the reason why the book talks so much about race, even as it tracks my journey towards my transgender identity, is because so much of what the performances and the ways in which I was as a gendered individual was filtered through my experiences of race. So when I started in college, I had only been in I had only been in the States for 3 years, and I was a scholarship kid at Harvard, had no idea what was going on. And it was really me sort of allowing people to perceive me as, and for me to act as a white person that in some ways foreshadowed some of my behaviors in early transition, right? Which come out of this sense of these insecurities, right? I was in a really difficult situation, and I was afraid of being the poor immigrant Filipino kid that I was in this super, super rarefied environment. And in the same way, in early transition, I was very much, I transitioned in my early 20s at a time, in the early 2000s, at a time when at least, the vast majority of people around me who were transitioning, at later ages. And also, and also I was in Boston, Massachusetts, which was a predominantly white area. And when I noticed that I wasn't as visibly trans as other people who were transitioning, I really, I took that on and was very much, behaved like I was exceptionalizing myself. I'm not that type of trans person. People perceive me as a woman. I'm different from other trans people, and I think it was really important for me to portray those experiences and portray who I was then and what I was thinking then, because not doing that, A, would have been dishonest, but also B, would have really, I think, defeated the purpose for me of writing the memoir. Defeated, because what I want is for somebody to read this who may be going through some of the experiences that I went through, and see that there's a possible way to do it differently, or see that these were things that harmed me when I did them, and maybe they'll do things differently, rather than if I portrayed myself in this sort of glossy kind of noble way, right?
Yes. So in the Philippines, colorism is very embedded in classism. And you had also mentioned that you were a child actor and being, of fair skin when you were there. Did you notice that people were treating you different because of the fact that you were lighter skinned and you were an actor? Or was it because you were in a small town that these kinds of conceptions were a little bit diluted?
I mean, I still, whenever I go back to the Philippines, and I go back pretty often, the people still, strangers would come up to me and say, oh, I wish, I had your skin, right? And I'm just like, well, I have very poor vision because I'm albino. Like maybe you wouldn't wish that for yourself, right? But but it is such an embedded part of the culture there. But it's also, like the culture of beauty, right? Filipinos are completely obsessed with beauty pageants, and I think that's one of the, one of the more unspoken. Even as we're kind of, we are one community, and we are, and trans women, trans people, we all belong to the same community in one sense, but each of us has our own individual experiences, and I think it's been very important for me to own up to my privileges, both as a Filipino person and as a trans person. And one of those privileges has certainly been having the option to, to having the option to not reveal to people that I'm trans, right? And that's tough, it's a really tough position to be in, because it's simultaneously, it's simultaneously a privilege, but it's also very lonely psychologically, right? Because when you're the exception, even if the exception puts you in a, in a theoretically higher or better position, being an exception also means that you're alone, right? That you don't have other people around you. I feel like this is a good segue into the section that I wanted to read of Fairest. I'm a person who has two pairs of glasses, speaking of eye stuff. And I'm supposed to read at the podium, I think just because it's more practical, so I don't have to hold a mic. So hold on one second. Beginning of section 2, beginning of the Harvard Man section. Hi. So I'm reading from my iPad, being an albino person with not great vision, and the book is divided into 3 sections. The first section is about my childhood in the Philippines. The second section is being in college at Harvard and the beginning of my awareness of my queer and trans identity. And the third section is a few years later, shortly before, about the circumstances that led to my transition. I am reading from the beginning of the second section of the Harvard. I figure since we're in a university environment, that's what I'm going to read. And also, there is a Haitian cab driver in this section, but I actually have not interacted with a lot of Haitian people, so I apologize for, but at the same time, it feels weird to say his dialogue in a completely American accent, so please bear with me, especially if you're from Haiti or have family or friends in Haiti. Okay, this is chapter 7. Harvard Square, I replied as casually as I could when the taxi driver at Logan Airport asked where I was going. I used my bags as an excuse to splurge on a cab, but what I really wanted was to meet my future above ground, feel the curving road that followed the bank of the Charles, the chill of early autumn when I opened the car window. "Where do you come from?" the driver asked as I noticed the dark skin on his nape from the back seat, the close-shaved hair below his newsboy cap. He spoke in an accent I couldn't exactly place, though I could tell it was from somewhere France had colonized. "California," I replied, routing out the vowels in Cal to imply that I've lived there all along and didn't come from a place where vowel sounds were simple and abrupt. "Ah, Beverly Hills," he asked. Beverly Hills?" he asked. "Santa Monica. A friend took me to that city once, and when we got to the wooden pier that embraced the water, it made me wish I could live there." "I'm from Haiti." "Vous parlez français?" "Ah oui, comment vous pouvez parler ma langue? J'étudie français à l'école. Votre accent est excellent." It was true, I had a good ear and didn't need much practice to make sounds like those around me, whether in English or French. My family's premonition did come true, that once I copied their accent, white people thought I was white, or American, as Filipinos put it, at least until those white people talked about something obvious I didn't understand, like homecoming or Jimi Hendrix. Before I came to the US, it did not occur to me to question why people from home said American when they meant white. I didn't ask why they called Black people Negroes even when they were also American. I wasn't even aware of other races, that Americans would call my family Asian, or that there were Latinos who came from Mexico and made up the majority of the kids in my high school, even though almost all the students in my honors classes were white. I quickly confirmed that it was to my benefit to seem white too. "You go to Harvard?" the driver asked. "I'm starting this year." "You're lucky." I wondered whether it was the college I glimpsed in the distance, even though to me those far-off buildings were just indistinct patches of red. As I fantasized about what it would be like to walk through those grand halls every day, I also dreamed up private school friends I'd be seeing soon, a spacious house close to the beach, and a white mom and dad who bid me goodbye. "Where are your parents?" the driver asked. I told them I'd rather go alone. This was literally true, even though my attitude of carefree independence was not. Because Mama did want to come, but I refused because I didn't want her to feel any part of my success. With my grandfather's help, we eventually moved out of the creepy nursing home. We lived in a nursing home for my first 6 months in the States, and into a dinky apartment close to my high school. But it was also around the time that Mama discovered the casinos in California. She left me, my younger brother, and our 2 half-siblings from another man she was no longer with to go on gambling binges that went on for weeks. This forced my other grandmother, Nanay Minyang, to come live with us, a woman whose every word was either a whine or a shout, though at least she kept us fed. I maintained my grades through this turmoil because I knew a college scholarship was my only chance to escape. "Why did you choose to come to Boston?" I asked. "I did not choose," he replied. "My parents are here and their relatives before. My father drives a taxi, so I drive a taxi." I wished I could have told him how alike we were, that I ended up in California not because of rich white parents, but because my relatives were there when we immigrated, in smoggy Chino and not Santa Monica. But I was already too deep inside the fantasy I'd built for his benefit and mine. I held my breath as the cab turned to cross a short bridge from Storrow to Memorial Drive. We passed buildings I knew were collectively known as the River Houses, dorms for upperclassmen. And as the cab went through Cambridge streets to deposit me next to the passageway that led to my dorm in Harvard Yard, and my roller baggage rattled through the uneven brick sidewalk, I fancied that if I could dream my future into existence, maybe I could also dream away my past. Maybe I didn't have to be the child of poor immigrant parents who neglected him, who left everything he cared about to be in this country, literally half a world away. If I could turn the dream of becoming a Harvard student into reality, maybe I could just forget that I was anything other than American, live and study among my rich white friends, never have to deal with my life being cleaved. Maybe this was the place where I could erase everything about me that didn't add up or make sense, the place where I could finally belong. Thank you. It didn't work out, by the way.
I remember this specific reading it the first time did make me cry. This particular part, the idea of the erasure of your own identities in order to get ahead or belong. What I found so interesting in kind of in comparison to this is later when talking to what I remember is like a lover of yours, and that lover said, oh, didn't know that you were Asian, didn't realize you were trans, and you felt like a distinct sense of wanting to be seen. And those two passages are very different. Also made me cry. But because of that, I was kind of wondering, like, when you were writing this, did you connect those two concepts together, the beginning of your college life and further on in your journey in self-identity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because one of the reasons why I decided on a structure in which I would have these moments in the main narrative, you know, which was happening in this particular case in the 90s, and then the narrative, there would be these self-contained sections where the narrative would jump in time to the more recent past. In this particular case, 2014, because I really wanted to explore precisely this, right? Like this sort of juxtaposition between how I felt about myself then and how I ended up feeling about myself. You know, in this particular case, I'm trying to remember, you know, like almost 20 years later, right, when I was more firmly grounded in America, and I think it was a really funny. I also spent a significant amount of time. Actually, it ended up being more like 7 or 8 years in grad school. I went to grad school at Cornell. I did an MFA, and an MFA and an MA there. And I call myself accidentally stealth. Because for people who are not familiar with this term, stealth means that that you are not disclosed as trans. Somebody who has transitioned but aren't telling people that, but nobody knows that they're trans. And I say that I was accidentally stealth because I was out as queer, and I was very outspoken about being queer, and I was very outspoken about queer and trans issues. But I didn't explicitly tell people that I was trans. And I assumed that everybody knew and was just being polite until I started writing about being trans in 2014, at which point a bunch of people were very surprised. But I remember that period just being so concerned about, you know, about people finding out, and then people, you know, and then bad things happening if they found out, and bad things actually did happen once they came out, by the way. So my fears were at least somewhat founded, or actually were very much founded. But during that period, that early period in 2014, which was literally, like I was dating this guy who in the book is named Barrett. That's not his actual name. But he said something like, oh, I know that you're trans, but I can't tell because to me, you just have a dancer's body. And I knew when he said, oh, to me, you just have a dancer's body, he meant a white dancer, a white woman dancer, right? And then he said, yeah, and I can't, because it's very hard for me to picture you as Asian. And there was just this moment when I was just like, oh, like that's not actually what I want, And for so long, what I thought I wanted was for people to not know these things about me so that I would be protected. But I didn't fully account for how psychologically punishing that is, and also that really every person should expect better, both of themselves and of the people who they are close to, right? That the people who are close to you should know everything about you, especially the really, really important fact that you are, that you are an Asian person from the Philippines who is trans. And unfortunately, my husband is about 10 minutes away doing our taxes. Otherwise, I would just be like my husband, Josh, who, who very much appreciates, all of the facets of my personality, except perhaps my inability to do our taxes myself.
Okay, so in the Philippines, we have this saying, I'll translate it in English, but we say, guwapo pa naman, sayang. It's like, too bad you're like good looking, too bad you're bakla, like you're queer. And I was sort of thinking about that when you recounted the drag night at Harvard, and you were it was the first, well, I don't remember if you were saying how it was the first time that you were dressing up in women's clothes, and there was a sense of fear there. Was that kind of like attitude towards queer people in the Philippines sort of affecting you at that time, where, because you have mentioned earlier that your academics was a way for your parents to pay attention to your excellence, like was there like a sayang kind of feeling in yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was definitely a sense. I had a very specific image of myself, and presenting myself as feminine was not part of that image. And it wasn't just, it wasn't just aesthetic. It wasn't just, kind of like being perceived. Before transition and before I was out, when I was in the Philippines, of course, people were just like, oh, like people were like presenting, girls to me and just being like, hey, prospect, right? But I think it wasn't just the sense of kind of like physical, of like my physical embodiment as male. It was holistic. It was more the sense that, especially as I was the firstborn male child of my generation, and my dad was the firstborn male child of his generation, and like being eldest in families is very important in like in Filipino families. And so there was just this sense that I had this position that I needed to live up to. And, and being at Harvard certainly, cemented me as a sort of like generational leader of my family. And so, and I think, and so the idea of dressing in women's clothes, even though it's more, in some ways, socially more acceptable in the Philippines, it wasn't acceptable for me in my position as the person that my family and my entire family's generation was looking up to as the sort of like vanguard in America, right? So this was one way in which I think my like my cultural and my gender identities were definitely, definitely very much were clashing with each other in ways that I didn't even consciously realize until, there was just this, the dorm that I happened to live in at Harvard has a tradition every year called Drag Night, where where people just dress in drag, and I had no intention of participating, except one of my friends was just like, "Oh, like you're exactly my size, why don't you come to my room, right?" And not realizing how much I was suppressing. Until I actually put on a dress and was just like, whoa, okay, what is this? Like, why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling? Why do I feel so, comfortable and affirmed in this, in this identity in a way that that 5 minutes before I had no inkling that that was the case, right?
Something that, I had a hard time in this book, but definitely have grown to love after reading it through. The beginning was hard, was this idea that we're watching you grow, your values and your perspectives grow. So small you had a very American exceptionalism value, did not really understand colonialism or any of those things, and we watch you grow out of that, which was really affirming for me to read. So something that I was wondering was, in this journey of that you take us with you of basically deconstructing American propaganda and colonialism that was like socialized in you. I want to know more about that journey, because it's littered throughout the book, but it seems like such a important thing in the journey of from you as a small child to at the end of the book where you were.
I think one thing for people who aren't familiar with the Philippines or, that much with Philippine history that's important to understand is that the American military built the Filipino education system, right? So as a result, and, American, it was part of American interests to keep Filipinos docile and cooperative. So essentially, I grew up with a curriculum that had no works by non-white people, and also really, just really magnified the American military, right? So Ernest Hemingway was definitely super important, and we read Tom Sawyer, but not Huckleberry Finn, for instance. That's, and so I think. So it was this really kind of like fascinating experience, first reading about American neocolonialism, that I just remember. The funny thing was that my mom worked at a printing press that printed American books for Filipino kind of elite audiences. And there was this book, called, I think it was just like The United States and the Philippines, A Study in Neocolonialism, which is basically, was just like, even though the Philippines is, is nominally independent, it's still so financially dependent on the United States that it might as well be a colony, right? And I was 8 when I first got a hold of it, and I remembered, and I saw, oh, like this is important, but I can't understand this. So I just kept it for, like several years. And I think it was like, like I was like 11 or 12 by the time that I understood it well enough to understand what, what it was talking about. And also the fact that the United States was the biggest ally of Ferdinand Marcos, who was, the Philippines dictator for 20 years, right? And so I just remember feeling so angry and just being so, and feeling so like blindsided and hoodwinked, right? And I feel like my entire life is sort of a cyclical version of that. Where I would have these periods of just being like, oh, okay, like I'm in this environment, it's fine, it's great, things are going well, blah, 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 blah. And then something will happen where I'm just like, oh, I had no idea that, that this was happening or that was happening, right? And it's still, I think, it's still an ongoing negotiation. I think especially for somebody like me, who benefits adjacently from white privilege, there's always such a temptation of living in that illusion because it's so, it's so inviting because you don't have to think about all of the, all of the paradoxes and problems, but then something will happen that you will then realize, oh, like there's something that's really that's really terribly structurally wrong here. Like I feel like most recently I'm going to start on the faculty of the Antioch College Low Residency program in December. So I've just been reading up. I've been reading a lot about writing programs and, like the way the creative writing is taught, and just sort of like thinking about and reading a lot about how creative writing in the United States, and specifically Iowa, the University of Iowa, in the 1940s and 50s was actually CIA funded, and that the CIA encouraged those programs to focus on inward-looking, like apolitical stories, because they were concerned about, about artists becoming activists, right? And, like that's the latest thing that has made me angry. And I'm sure there will be more in the future.
So one thing that I really related to is this, like creating a story because you're in a new land that like people don't know, they can't like verify it. So for me, I moved here when I was 17 in 2016, and I did not speak a Tagalog word for like a year or two. I was just like talking and just watching YouTube videos of like vloggers and stuff, just to pretend that I grew up here and I was born here. Something that I really didn't realize until I was talking to my friends, and they were like, why do you talk like that? But I was wondering like how much of this world that you have created became subconscious, wherein you were sort of operating in what you have created for yourself, and how much of it was consciously trying to sort of cover the Asian side of you.
Well, it's really funny just because when you perform a role for long enough, it becomes you, right? I mean, it was really funny reading the section that I just read right now and talking about my accent and just being like, I want to say California, not as as California, like a Filipino person would say California, in this sort of, and not like round out that vowel in this Valley Girl kind of way, right? But I've done that for so long that, that speaking in a Filipino accent is what feels like performance, right? Unless I'm with Filipino people who are speaking with, you know, when I'm in the Philippines, I code switch back into a Filipino accent, right? And so there's this degree to which there's always, at least for me, like there's always slippage between what you intend and what, you know, and what you can't help, right? Like and I think, and I think they're also, at least for me, like one of the things that I've observed is you have all of these, they're reflections of your unconscious insecurities, right? So, you know, so for instance, when I was, when I was in grad school and people didn't know that I was trans, I spoke, you know, like with my voice pitched, you know, like at least a couple of steps higher, because I was concerned that people, you know, that people would read me as trans. And by the way, you know, I'm Filipino, so I love karaoke. I did not sing in public for a decade, at least, because of the fact that my natural range is a high baritone range, and people would know that I'm trans if I, you know, like if I sang at all, right? And so, and it's really interesting how so much of that, and it's really interesting now when people, you know, especially when there's this really funny thing that happens where the people, you know, like you're interacting with me, it's the first time that you're interacting with me, like the me that you see is the me that you will carry with you, you know, that your understanding of me, your feeling about who I am is what you would carry with you. And it's very funny because, you know, there are people who talk about me now, or who talk to me now and say, oh, you know, like, it's so funny when you say, that you weren't disclosed as trans, you know, for a long time, you know, because they feel like you're, you know, like you have a very kind of like staunchly, you know, like you're a trans editor, you're very kind of like, you don't seem concerned about those types of issues. And then I would just show them a picture of me, you know, like when I was in my 20s. I'm just like, look, I had this like long hair, and I was just like, and I never wore, you know, like I never wore pants. I always wore dresses, and I always wore heels, right? And it's really interesting how your self-presentation really reflects, you know, like reflects your hidden intentions, right? Like there's only so much that you can control. I, by the way, wanted to exude casualness, but at the same time wanted you to feel like I had a good design aesthetic in picking this outfit.
Well, I could probably ask you questions for the rest of the night, but I do want to turn it to the audience to see if anyone had a question. I will say that I'm very hard of hearing, so I will not be able to hear your question, but hopefully Meredith can, so speak really loud. If anyone has a question, feel free to raise their hand and we'll try to, oh, there's a mic going around too, it looks like.
Hello. So I have a few questions, actually. I had to write them down. So starting with kind of what you talked about with the white authors and in the schools reading them. So early on, when you
can you speak a little bit more loudly?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Going back to what you said about white authors and in school having to only basically reading white authors. Mm-hmm. Did that affect your writing early on at all? As in, like in your stories, were you writing about the people around you, or were you writing about similar things to like what you were reading?
Well, it's funny just because I entered creative writing sort of in a sideways angle. So I actually grew up not believing that I could be a writer, simply because I never read any writers who looked like me or had, you know, like any of my experiences. So I did not think of myself as potentially being a writer until after college. I studied English and I was planning to be an academic. You know, like I was good enough to study writers, but it was not in my worldview that I could be a writer. But what was really funny was that once I realized that I could be a writer, then that was during the period when there was a fair amount of immigrant writing, right? So, that was a period when ZZ Packer and Jhumpa Lahiri and Junot Diaz, were sort of making their mark on the literary world. So I think I had role models in that sense, but it was also really difficult because of the fact that my influences were so white-driven. So I think it definitely took me a while. What I actually did, it's funny because what I actually did for grad school MFA applications was I read Flannery O'Connor, and then I wrote stories like Flannery O'Connor, except I set them in the Philippines with Filipino characters. That's what got me into grad school. And then I thought I was just going to do other things, but then they kept wanting me to write those stories, and I'm rebellious, so I didn't.
Yeah, and then for another question, kind of more about your your style and whatnot, because you briefly mentioned writing for BuzzFeed, and that you were kind of writing for a different group than you kind of really wanted to. So I was wondering if your style changed at all from writing for a different group, and then also kind of how did writing for a different group kind of help you write this book and whatnot?
Right. Well, it's funny because I literally, this is funny because I literally went from 1 week being in a comparative literature PhD program at Cornell to the following week starting at BuzzFeed. And so I went from, sort of like speaking in, like talking about the hermeneutics of the self and, sort of like post-colonial, like post-colonial structures in Deleuze and Guattari to like literally communicating in animated GIFs, right? And it speaks to my Filipino code switching abilities that I figured out how to navigate those environments. I think with BuzzFeed, the BuzzFeed experience specifically, BuzzFeed very much focuses on virality, as people know. That's a very big, like how. Like every story that you write for BuzzFeed on the back end, we see in real time how many people are reading it and interacting with it and how long we have all of those statistics. And so I think that period made me really aware of the type of work or the type of writing that is popular. But ironically, it made me aware that it wasn't the type of writing that I really wanted to do in the long term. So I was only at BuzzFeed for a little over a year, partly for that reason. And that, at least for me, what's most important is the quality of people's engagement with my work, rather than the sheer number of people who are reading it. And and that's that's something that I've realized about myself, and that my main focus in terms of selling books is just so that my publisher would be happy with me so that I can publish my next book.
And then just last question, only because I know my friends at Harvard would kill me if I didn't ask. Where do you live your freshman year?
Oh, I lived in Wigglesworth, which is a Harvard dorm that sounds super Harry Potter-esque. And I know we're not supposed to talk about Harry Potter because of J.K. Rowling, but I just did, so. True.
I get the impression that you didn't know you were trans prior to when you got older. Did you have any inkling at all, or did you have any type of trans role models or anything when you were growing up? And now that you are kind of out and you've written a book and things, do you have any feeling that you should be, or do you have any, do you feel an obligation to advocate for trans people and for people coming out and so forth?
Yeah, growing up, I knew that I was bakla, and bakla in the Philippines is a really, really fraught category because it's sort of in between. It's often translated as gay, but it also is classified as gender nonconforming, right? So you can be, so basically, like, I was internally bakla and I knew that I was bakla, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I would present as a woman, or like I would present in a feminine way. And what's really funny is that growing up, I had a cousin, Sunny. I actually had a couple of cousins who were super effeminate and were very much, kind of like the more stereotypical feminine third gender people. And I definitely looked at them and in certain ways felt envy towards them. But at the same time, also was just like, I can never do that. Like, I can never be that type of bakla because it would mean sacrificing all of these things, right? Because in the Philippines, even though bakla have a social role, they're at least, when I was growing up, their prospects were limited. Like, you can only be, an entertainer or in a feminine profession like fashion designers or hairstylists or florists, et cetera, et cetera. And I wanted to be an astronaut, of course. And so, or some sort of whatever, quote unquote, serious profession. And so it was this really funny thing where when I went to college, I came out as gay. I was very secure in being gay and was just like, okay, like, I am a gay man. Like, this is who I am. And then drag night happened and I was just like, oh, okay, wait, maybe not just gay.
Courtney, you had a question, right?
Oh, wait, there was a second part to your question, which is, do I feel a sense of obligation to, to be an activist or which I do, and I feel like as a politicized Filipino person, it was really funny recently. I wrote an extensive bio of myself, and I didn't put in activist, and a friend asked me why, and I was just like, oh, I just felt like that was just me being Filipino, is like speaking up for political issues. I think because I grew up in a dictatorship, it's been really important for me to write on those issues, even though I don't necessarily, I perceive myself primarily as an artist rather than as an activist, if one were to divide those two things.
Other questions?
Out of curiosity, I don't know anything about Filipino language, but I'm assuming, did you write in both languages? Or did you write it in English and did it get transferred?
Oh, I wrote this book in English. Yes. I mean, there's some Tagalog in the book, but not very much. Yeah.
And did you get it translated at all, or?
No, it hasn't been translated into Tagalog. In part because the publishing industry in the Philippines is primarily English driven. But I would love for it to, to be translated one of these days. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Hi, Meredith. My name's Katie, and I also have albinism. So I'm legally blind, And in the world of COVID and all of the Zoom rooms that we sit in, I've noticed a trend that I hope will move faster even, of people doing visual descriptions of themselves, which I appreciate as a legally blind person. And it feels really intimate and special to me to hear about the way that other people look. And that seems to be really important, like how you're perceived, especially when you're thinking about gender identity and stuff like that. And I was wondering if you had noticed that, and if you had any particular feelings about visual description in the world that we live in now.
Yeah, that has definitely been a trend. I first noticed it with this talk with two friends of mine, Jenna Wortham and Kimberly Drew, for their talk Black Futures, and I forgot to do it tonight. So I am an albino, Filipino. I feel like I'm gender neutral presenting right now with medium straight blonde hair, wearing dark but colorful clothes, and we are on the stage lit with spotlights. And I do think, at least for me, it's odd just because with visuality, I'm kind of two minds. You know, there's a certain way in which I do think. I think that obviously, like, accessibility is super important. But I'm also kind of sensitive to sort of performative accessibility. So, so one of the things that I tend to ask whenever actions are taken are, like, who benefits, like, why is the specific action being taken? And I don't know, and I guess, like, like right now, for instance, when I look at you, what I see are basically swaths of color, right? And I have enough experience to know what those swaths of color correspond to, right? That's probably a dress shirt over there, and it's probably a dress because it covers more of, like, it extends longer on the person's body, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess for me, because I grew up in a culture where it's very much, like, you make do with what you have, right? I'm actually not very used to asking for things, right? I'm very used to being like, okay, like, these are the conditions that I've been given. And this is what I'm going to accept. And I do think that that's something that I certainly, and all of us, need to think about and need to contemplate how, how the world can be better for disabled people, and also how there's this weird way in which disability is often categorized, thought of to be different from, other marginalized identities like, like race or gender, but we as a society also construct disability, right? I'm a person who happens to be, this is the example that I always give, like, I'm a person who happens to be very flexible, and like, I can fold myself in half, I can, like, cross my legs and fold myself in half, right? Imagine if I were normal and all of the chairs in this room are constructed so that there's only like half the space and everybody's expected to fold in half, right? Then you're the ones who are going to be disabled and I'm the one who's going to be normal. And so, and so that's something that I think about a lot in terms of, and that's something that I have to challenge myself consistently is to really think through, like how the world constructs both able-bodiedness and disability. Sorry, that was a long answer.
I didn't hear what this person said. Were they asking for an image description?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna do.
Well, not directly.
Not directly? Okay, sorry.
That's it. So, Meredith, I'm interested, describe the culture of child TV stars in the Philippines, because in this country, a lot of memoirs of terrible trauma, abuse, early drug addiction, the childhood TV stars of a certain era in this country were horribly treated. What was the experience in your country, your home country?
I was only a child star for 3 or 4 years, and I refused to act afterwards because, in part because of those conditions, right? So, so I had taping 2 or 3 times a week through past midnight, and then I had school the next day, and I just remember like the first report card I got after I started my TV show, and I had all of these twos in the Philippines. At least in my school, it was a 1 to 5 system, and I always only had 1s, which were the best grades. And then I had all of these 2 and 3s, and I just remember like crying the whole day. And so after the TV show that I was in finished, they actually tried to cast me in, at the time, the most popular soap opera in the Philippines as like the villain, which would have meant more like 4 or 5 times a week of taping. So then I just escaped to the province and said, I refuse to act. I want to maintain my grades. I want to study. And so, I don't know, like, I'm not sure exactly how I was able to do that and be that independent as a kid. But I'm thankful that I did, because I do think that even that small amount of fame was actually like not really great for me. And I'm still kind of like dealing with the effects of it as an adult.
Do you have one more question to wrap
Just
it up?
one quick question, yeah. So next year is the Philippine presidential election, and you talk about the dictatorship in your book, which is a very touchy subject in the Philippines right now. So the dictator's son is running for president next year. Have you had people reach out about like your stance with the Marcos family or that section of your book?
Yeah, it's funny. I've had private political conversations, but I haven't had any public conversations about the Philippines. I think in part because in the public sphere, I tend to be thought of as a trans author primarily, more than as a Filipino author or public figure. So I haven't been explicitly asked to weigh in, but of course I am very anti nepotistic dynasties, and am very saddened about the state of Philippine politics and the ways in which the Philippines hasn't really figured out how to construct a fully functional justice system, right? Not that the U.S. is sort of great from that perspective either, but the Philippines, it's more visible and glaring. Yeah.